Hello, my friends, and welcome back to another episode of Voices in the Game. Wherever you are listening or watching, we are happy you are joining us today. I cannot wait to get our conversation started with our next guest. He is a sports broadcaster and really a jack of all trades. He is a broadcaster, a writer, and he also has his own podcast, anything and everything related to the three-time Stanley Cup champions, the New Jersey Devils, on his podcast Devil's State of Mind. He is Neil Villapiano. Neil, how you doing, my friend? Thank you so much for coming on.
That was a fantastic intro, Colton. I appreciate that. I'm doing very well today. A little bit, unfortunate, a little bit under the weather, but nonetheless, I'm excited to be here, and I appreciate being on here and talking to you.
Oh, of course, Neil. Yeah, and I hope you're feeling better, and we are so happy that you are spending your night with us. Really appreciate it.
It's that time of the year with like allergies, especially like here in New Jersey. It just the weather keeps going up and down, so it's been kicking my rear end of late. But I'm fighting through it, and I should be okay the next day or two.
And just in time for the Stanley Cup Finals, right?
Of course, with what's game six tonight?
Yep,
In
Game
just a
Six tonight.
couple hours, maybe the last game of the season. Who knows?
All righty, Neil. Yeah, so let's get started. So, can you take us back to the beginning? What first drew you to wanting to pursue a career in sports broadcasting? And was there really any particular moment, possibly watching or going to a Devils game growing up saying, hey, I think this is what I want to do?
It's a great question because I get asked it a lot. For me, I was very fortunate to grow up in a household that was very, very sports driven. One of the things that people recognize my last name for is the fact that my uncle, Phil Villapiano, played in the NFL. He was a left outside linebacker, played in the 70s and early 80s for both the Oakland Raiders, won a Super Bowl with head coach John Madden in 1976, and then also played for the Buffalo Bills. So, truth be told, even though I live in New Jersey, I also still have a soft spot for both the Raiders and the Bills. So, just because of, the family connection and all that. But yeah, no, for me, I always was infatuated with sports. My first dream, as many kids would have, is I wanted to play. I wanted to be a professional athlete, and I was into all sports. There was never one early on that really stood out to me. But as I got older, my dad used to say I have the gift of gab, and he found opportunities for me to learn about sports broadcasting. I went to different camps. The sports broadcasting camp with Jeremy Treatman. I did a camp up in North Jersey with Bruce Beck and Ian Eagle. Um, I learned over time that I really enjoyed it, that it was an opportunity for me to talk about the sports that I love, be passionate about it, and it's fun. And I'll never forget the legendary Doc Emrick, who was the play-by-play voice for the New Jersey Devils for many years, also on NBC, who's now retired. He always described it as you get a free ticket to the game, you get a really good view of the game, and you get to talk about it for 3-4 hours a night. And like to me, that was just an opportunity that I couldn't pass up. So from the time I was about maybe 9 or 10 to now is what I've always wanted to do, and I've gone through a lot of different journeys. I got my certification at Hofstra University for sports broadcasting and journalism. I've done a lot of different things over the years, covered a lot of different sports. Over the last 5, 6 years, I've really been more focused on hockey because it's the one that I'm most passionate about. And obviously, I have a podcast named after a team in the NHL. And ideally, that would be the sport that I would like to cover long term. So that's kind of the journey that I've kind of gone through up until this point.
Was there any particular moment, Neil, growing up where you thought, I think that my passion is with hockey, and I think that's the sport I want to try to focus on the most?
That's a tough question because I try to think back to like when did I really, really get invested? I think for me, it started in the 2012 Stanley Cup final run that the Devils had, led by Zach Parise, Ilya Kovalchuk, a rookie, Adam Henrique, the legendary Martin Brodeur, and so many others. And I really, really started to love the sport. I would watch every game. My first ever Devils jersey, fun fact for people that don't know, my first ever Devils jersey was a Ryan Carter jersey because I absolutely loved him along with Steven Gianta and Steve Bernier on that fourth line, the CVGV line as we called it in New Jersey. And really from that point on, I started to watch. I ended up playing. I learned how to skate when I was 14, so I was a very late, bloomer into like wanting to play. And I ended up deciding to play goalie because I absolutely loved watching Martin Brodeur play. I mean, I'm pretty lucky that I got to see arguably the greatest goaltender to ever lace him up play on a night-to-night basis, which was really, really fortunate for me. And I knew that I wasn't going to end up playing in the NHL, being 5'11", not really super skilled between the pipes. My ultimate goal was to play one full season of hockey, and I did it in high school. And once I was done with that, I was completely content with never playing again. I might play when I'm older, maybe in a beer league or something like that. Excuse me, down the road. But yeah, no, I started to watch more. I started to learn more, and I realized just how exciting it is to broadcast it again. Listening to the likes of Doc Emrick, Gary Thorne as well. Now we're listening to so many different guys. Brian Burke. We listen to Bob Wischusen, who right now is without question my favorite guy to do. Sean McDonough, Syracuse alum. Bill Spalding, another Syracuse alum who's doing the Devils right now. So many, John Forsland. I could just keep going on, which is guys that I've really loved listening to and wanted to emulate. And for the past 4 or 5 years on the podcast network that I'm a part of, we have a YouTube channel and we do this thing called live watch-alongs. And what'll happen is I'll be watching the game, whatever game it is, and the people who are watching will watch just me, and I'll have a scoreboard up, and I'll basically do like radio play-by-play because I can't legally show the game. And that's where I've really been able to hone in my skills. I've been able to broadcast for a couple of junior hockey teams, the Jersey Shore Whalers, Pro Tech Ducks, and New Jersey Titans. And really, it's just what I've loved for so long now. And now having the opportunity to have a podcast that is now just over 5 years old, covering the team that I love, and it's opened so many doors for me. I can sit here saying without question, I'm one of the luckiest guys in the industry, I think.
Oh yeah, that's all amazing, Neil. And obviously we'll get to the podcast later on. But I was just curious. So, like you mentioned, you really were, so fortunate being a Devils fan, getting the chance to listen, to guys like Doc Emmer before he went to NBC full time, and also Steve Cangelucci as
Yep.
well. So how did those guys, inspire you to perhaps be a sports broadcaster, knowing that you had the chance to watch those guys every Devils game?
So with Doc Emrick, I mean, he's the master of research, right? I mean, you could go to any game that he's ever done, and he has information on every player, on different leagues, different things like that, and he'll just bring it out randomly. And it just goes to show you how passionate he is about the sport. And I think he always understood the moment. And I think that's really what it was all about for me, learning how, the different types of calls you can make throughout the game. Sometimes you could be really, really high. Sometimes the call has to be a little bit less depending on the game and the situation that you're in. Um, but I think the biggest thing for me I took from Doc Emrick was his research and being able to be prepared to talk about everything. And there are obviously going to be periods throughout the game where maybe you have a minute or two to kind of talk about something other than the game going on. And he was really good at filling those moments with different things and having that great personality. With Steve Cangelosi, what I really loved about him was his narrating type of voice. One of the things that I really loved was when MSG would do promotions for different Devils situations, whether it was an intro for a game or maybe a hype up video for the playoffs or something like that. He was so good at it. He was so good at like just being in the moment and recognizing how important it was. And for him, his play-by-play was tremendous. And what I really loved about him was he was able to take his hockey play-by-play and do just as well while covering the New York Red Bulls in Major League Soccer. And now he's full-time doing Major League Soccer on Apple TV. And it's just really impressive to see guys be able to take their broadcasting skill from one sport and translate it into another. And that's what I take from him as well. It's just being able to adapt to different situations and adapting to the moment that you're in that moment, in those situations.
And of course, the Devils, three-time Stanley Cup champions, with three Stanley Cups over the span of 30 years in 1995, 2000, and 2003. So is there, out of those three, Neil, is there any that's like your favorite that speaks out to you? Because personally, for me, The 2003 Stanley Cup final is probably my favorite to watch, with that phenomenal series against the Ducks, went all the way to 7, and just hearing and watching Gary Thorne throughout that, that really is a top of my personal list, as really as one of my favorite finals ever.
Yeah, so funny enough, my favorite final that the Devils were in was actually in 2001. Despite not winning against the Colorado Avalanche, that was a great series because you had the two greatest goaltenders to ever play go up against one another in Patrick Waugh and Martin Brodeur. And the Devils were the defending champs, and you had the whole drama with Ray Bourque not having won a cup in 22 years at that point. And even though the Devils lost, I think it was important for Marty Brodeur to go up against his idol and a guy that he tried to emulate his game over and eventually become the goaltender that he became. But out of the three that we won, 2003 stands out to me the most. First and foremost, it's the one that I'm most conscious of remembering. I was born in 1997. So, truth be told, wasn't super conscious of all this stuff going on. But looking at 2003, what was really significant about it was the fact that Martin Brodeur shut out the Ducks three different times in that series, in game one, in game two, and most importantly in game seven. And even though he had a tremendous final, he was I'll say it very kindly here. He was passed over for John Sebastian Jaguar, who, don't get me wrong, had a great playoffs, but to not give Marty Brodeur his due of getting the Vezina Trophy and being considered the best player in the playoffs that year was tough. Was tough, but there were so many storylines going into that. You had the Anaheim Mighty Ducks, who came out of nowhere to get into that final, and they showed up. I mean, first two games they really got beat up by the Devils, understandably, but they fought back. And you had that infamous Game 6, right, where Paul Kariya gets absolutely obliterated at center ice by Scott Stevens, which you could definitely say in today's game, Colton, Scott Stevens would have been thrown out. Like, there's no question that he would have been ejected, and that would have been the end of it. But Paul Kariya to come back in that game and not only contribute but end up scoring and just having that blast, and you hear Gary Thorne's infamous call, off the floor, on the board. I mean, that's another example of how great Gary Thorne was at his goal calls and understanding the significance of that moment. And there were a couple of overtime games that the Ducks won. I think it was game both 3 and 4. They won in overtime. A lot of good storylines. And what's great about the Devils back then is, they looked like a team that was straight out of Central Casting. I mean, they were battle tested. This is a veteran Devils team. This is a team that's been through a lot. And the unsung hero for the Devils that year was Jeff Friesen. He came over in a trade from San Jose, and a lot of people were not sure what was going to happen with that and what he was going to be able to contribute. But he comes over in that, and it was kind of a controversial trade in that people don't understand, because at the time, we still had that line of, we still have Patrick Elias and Peter Sikora playing really well together. Sikora gets dealt to Anaheim. Friesen and Tverdovsky come back the other way, and you're not sure how it's all going to go down. Tverdovsky becomes a very reliable second-line defenseman, and you have Jeff Friesen have a tremendous year in the playoffs. Stanley Cup Finals had a couple of big-time goals, and it was great. It was great. And I think the one goal that stands out to me in that series for the Devils was Mike Rupp, who was a rookie in 2003, scored the first and what ended up being the game-winning goal in Game 7 on a deflection in front. And he's been immortalized in Devils history since that point. Despite him going to the Rangers at one point in his career, we don't try to hold that against him. But nonetheless, I think 2003 is the one that really, it's solidified, I think, for a lot of people that the Devils were one of the best teams in the league during that time, and one of those teams that became very respected throughout the league at that time, and something that I hope the Devils can get back to in the near future.
Yeah, definitely. It's just, speaking to me personally, with me being in Pittsburgh, of course, growing up a Penguins fan, but, I think of the Devils, especially, for me playing like NHL 2005, and, when you see Martin Brodeur as one of the intro guys, before you get into the game,
Right.
Those Devils teams, I was a little too young to remember when the Devils, like in the early 2000s, when they had those cuts. But, it's just like growing up a huge hockey fan too. It just seemed like that the Devils were just so fun to watch, and when you think of one person for the Devils at that time, you obviously think of who you mentioned, and that is Mr. Marty Brodeur.
For
So,
sure.
yeah, so and then fast forward, Neil, to the turn of the decade in the 2020s, how your Devil State of Mind podcast came to life. Where did the inspiration come from for you to begin the podcast?
This is one of my favorite stories to tell people because it's really kind of a matter of luck. And, I live under the impression of you never know who you're talking to and you never know what could happen. So in 2020, it was May of 2020, and, the pandemic had just started. And for me, I was finishing up my associate's degree at my local community college, and I wasn't really sure exactly what the next step of my, media career was going to be. And one day I was just scrolling through Twitter, and there was this podcast that was covering the Minnesota Wild that was asking a question to just random hockey fans. And I don't remember exactly the question off the top of my head, but I ended up responding to that to that tweet, and there was this kind of like a whole thread of just me and this guy just like kind of going back and forth in a positive way. So then he DMs me and says, "Hey, I would really like to have you on my podcast for an episode." And I was like, "Great." And he's like, "Yeah, we could talk about the Wild. We could also talk about the Devils because I see that you're kind of a big Devils guy." I said, "Sure." So I jump on, and and the guy's name, by the way, is Isha Jerome, in case people want to know. And Isha and we did the interview. It was great. And then right after it, he goes, "Hey, listen, on our network, the Hockey Podcast Network, we're actually looking for a new Devils host. We don't have anybody. Would you like to be that guy?" And I said, "Absolutely. I'd love to, do that and be a part of a network and have that, opportunity." So great. So over the next couple of weeks, I spoke with both Isha and Dylan Kaiser, who is still currently at the network to this day. And we were kind of going back and forth on different names, ones that were not taken, obviously. We had to look at copyright. And I came across the song by Frank Sinatra called New York State of Mind. And I saw it and I said, "What about Devil's State of Mind?" And I remember my brother saying, "Wow, that is a really, really good name. Like, that is really good." So I suggested it. We looked it up to make sure it wasn't already taken. It wasn't. And on June 1st of 2020, the Devil State of Mind podcast was officially born. 5 years later, it is without question one of the most listened to podcasts, not just on the Hockey Podcast Network, but one of the most listened to Devils podcasts out there today. And I'm not just saying that to brag about myself or to pat myself on the back, but just looking at how popular it's been and how many opportunities it's opened for me. It's allowed me to have a journalism career and to write for Pucks and Pitchforks over on Fansided, which I absolutely love. And I've been able to work with a bunch of sponsors, DraftKings, Tom's River Brewing, Game Time, all these different things. And also just being able to make new friends and to meet people and interact with people. I have created a Devils family and that I look forward to seeing at every game that I go to. And I love it. I love every single bit of it. And I'm so fortunate that I get to do it. And I'm excited. I've been saying this the last couple weeks here with my podcast that I'm really excited for this upcoming year because I have a bunch of new stuff ready to, showcase to everybody. And I'm excited to take my podcast to another level.
How were you able to grow this podcast, Neil, into really what it is today? Like you mentioned, really building a family and also, getting sponsors into the mix as well. How were you able to do all that in a 5 year span?
Being incredibly active, I think, is the best way to describe it. For me, being a young person at 28 years of age, I'm in the social media boom, and I made sure to push on social media as much as possible, joining groups, messaging people, different things like that, and over time, just developing that fan base. And I think that creating graphics, doing different things like clips and giveaways and other things like that, overall helped me. But I think also just me being myself and talking to people and just creating those kind of relationships helped me out tremendously. Having the backing of THPN has helped me tremendously. Um, but I also would like to say that my constant drive to wanting to do better every single episode and just give my opinion, whether people agree or not, and just keep going, I think is important. And being consistent, because I think consistency is always the thing that's going to attract people to you. Is that if they know consistently you're going to be putting out episodes and you're going to be doing things, they look for that. They start to look for it. They start to expect it. Oh, it's Monday. That means a new episode's coming out. Now, granted, this week with me being under the weather, it's not been doable, but nonetheless, it's just in general like being able to be, consistent, and also being young has definitely played to my advantage because I can relate with a lot of the younger generation of Devils fans who have not been able to experience some of those really awesome memories that the Devils gave us in the late 90s, early 2000s, and even in the early 2010s as well.
And obviously, you've had a lot of guests in that 5 year span. Has there been any favorite guest or just guest, if you could have like a top 10 or a top five that you've had on the podcast?
Yeah, I mean, the first ever big guest I had on was former NHL goaltender Jonas Hiller, who played for the Anaheim Ducks, and he's from Sweden, Switzerland. He never played for the Devils, but I remember watching him play when I was younger, and I actually was able to get him on through LinkedIn, which was really funny that I was able to actually speak to him and do that. So that was great. I got Ryan Carter on the podcast, and that was really fun because I got to show him my jersey and kind of talk about from my perspective those type of things. Um, my good buddy Pasha from Spit and Chicklets, who's a big Devils fan. If you guys listen or watch Spit and Chicklets, you know who Pasha is. You know what he's been able to bring. I've also been fortunate to have you know Brendan Burke, the broadcaster for the New York Islanders, on my podcast one time or the other, and then I think there's a couple of when I look at it, there's a couple of journalists that I've been able to have on. Alex Chauvency of the Hockey Writers, Christy Flannery of the Hockey News, James Nichols of New Jersey Hockey Now, Daniel Amoya of the Hockey Writers. Just guys that I really appreciate reading their stuff. And with so much more Devils coverage, it's just great. It's just great to have that. And I think for me, I would say honestly, my favorite type of interviews, Colton, are ones with fans and people who have some sort of a personal connection with the team, because my whole thing is this podcast is for the fans by a fan. And that's the way that I look at it. And I try to make it as collaborative as possible and giving fans the opportunity to come on, talk about their fandom of hockey, their fandom of the Devils, and things that they got going on in their own lives. And I really love that because I feel like it just opens up the world to different types of people. And you learn so much about people, not just from a Devils perspective, but from a human perspective as well.
What was Ryan Carter's reaction, Neil, when you told him about his jersey when you showed him it?
I think he said that other than his parents, I'm the only other person that has a Devils Ryan Carter jersey in their closet. And I think he was very flattered by that because it's just kind of interesting how the first guy that really stood out to me was a guy that played on the fourth line of our team in 2012. Like, it's funny how sometimes we get infatuated with the non-superstar like players. And I think for me, it was just awesome to have that opportunity to speak to him and to really tell him how much his play and everything really, really meant a lot to me. And being able to show him my support with having a jersey, I think is great. Wish I would have been able to send it to him and maybe get it signed, but nonetheless, that's an interview that to this day is one of my favorite ones that I've done.
Yeah, that is awesome, Neil. And take us through the process of how it is like preparing for each episode, because I assume that it's not just you get on the air and then you just talk about the Devils. I'm sure there's a lot of work behind the scenes getting ready for it.
For sure. I spend a lot of time looking at relevant Devils news, especially right now in the off season when there's not a whole lot to really talk about on a week to week basis. You try to look for different things. You look to maybe what maybe some of the writers have been putting out or rumors that have been going out. Sometimes I'll look for just try to find a guest to come on and talk about the Devils, just to kind of get a different perspective. I had a couple guests on the last few episodes, which has been great. But really, for me, it's just about making sure I know exactly what I want to talk about and having every single bit of information I can for it, because I think it's important for people to listen to my podcast and not just feel like that they understand what's going on, but also know they're getting it from somebody who's truly doing their research and doing their background work. And I think for me, being respected is the most important thing to me, because that's all I want. It's all that I love when people say they respect me as a podcaster, as a journalist, giving my opinion. It goes a long way. So it takes time. It takes time because you have to get into a rhythm of this is what you're going to talk about, and now let's dive deeper into it. Let's get some information. Maybe there's a fun fact that nobody's brought up that you can bring up that could be really that could make the whole argument or topic that much more interesting. I think that that's really where it just kind of all comes down to. So really for me, and I would say this to anybody out there, whether you're doing podcasting, television, radio, journalism, whatever, preparation and research are the two most important things. You have to know your stuff. You have to know your stuff, and you have to know it very well, because otherwise people, even just the regular Joe Schmoes out there, are going to figure out very quickly whether you know your stuff or not. And I think that's really important if you want to grow in this industry.
And this is actually a question I meant to ask a little earlier. I would imagine that you have a dream guest to have on the podcast. Who would be that person be if you could pick anybody on the planet to be on your podcast?
Wow, I mean that's something I haven't, it's funny, it's something I haven't really thought about that much over time, but I think if I were to pick one, I would probably pick Martin Brodeur, because of just the fact that he's the greatest player to ever play for the New Jersey Devils. He has a boatload of stories. He's now the assistant GM of this team. I mean, he bleeds Devils red and black. And I think for me, it would just be awesome to interview a legend that I grew up watching. A close second would be Doc Emrick, because again, it would just be having the opportunity to pick his brain a little bit, talk about his time in New Jersey, how much it means to him, and just advice that he could give myself and anybody listening, and just being able to learn from one of the best in the business.
Yeah, definitely. And can you tell us, Neil, actively, what are your other responsibilities in this industry, and how are you able to juggle everything that you do at one certain time?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's not an easy thing, but if you're super passionate about it and you enjoy doing it, it makes it that much easier to do these things all the time and juggle everything. So yeah, other than my podcast, as I mentioned before, I do a lot of live watch along, play by play on our YouTube channel. I did the first two games of the Stanley Cup Finals this year on our network. I do a bunch of Devils games throughout the season as well. I also, as I mentioned as well, I write for Pucks and Pitchforks, which covers the New Jersey Devils. Over on Fanside, I try to post about an article a week over there, and we have a lot of great guys. Nick Villano, who's kind of like our main guy in charge, and you have different guys like Trey Matthews, who actually does a podcast called Locked On Devils. He also, writes for them, and we have a lot of great guys working over there. So, yeah, so I do that. I'm also been doing a little bit of social media work for a local soccer team, not far from my house, doing a lot of Twitter action for them. So that's been very enjoyable. Called FC Monmouth. Highly recommend you go check it out. We're an undefeated men's six-tier soccer team. We're very good, very good. I also cover the Brooklyn Nets for a website called The Lead, and every team has their own Twitter account. I'm in charge of the Nets Twitter account. Grown up a Nets fan my whole life, and I love doing that because that's a lot more fun for me, because it's not broadcasting, it's not journalism, it's just going on Twitter and interacting with fans, creating graphics, and just chatting about Nets basketball. Like, it's fun. And then yeah, like I run my own Twitter account. I run the Devil State of Mind social media. I tell people all the time, when you're interacting with the podcast on social, it's just me. There's no one else that's doing it with me. I just do it all on my own. And yeah, that's all the stuff that I juggle with on a day-to-day basis.
What are the main keys, Neil, for when you specifically do social media? For anybody anybody who's listening right now who might have that dream or that aspiration, to maybe be the main social media manager for a team.
I think the biggest thing, and it's similar to what I said before, I think it's about consistency. I think really what you have to do is you have to be up to date with a lot of the trends that go on. And you got to look around and see what people are talking about and what people are, what's interesting them. And, you got to look on all social media platforms. You got to look on Twitter. You got to look on Instagram, TikTok, even Facebook and Snapchat. I know those aren't super popular, but like, and even LinkedIn, I'm being serious. Like even on LinkedIn, I see stuff all the time. I mean, that's how you and I connected on, right then and there. So like that's all of that just kind of goes around just having relevant content to post and being consistent with it because that's the only way that you're going to truly build your portfolio, whether it's the team's portfolio or your own personal one. And I tell people all the time, especially social media people, if you haven't started a gondola page, I highly recommend that you do so. Gondola is a great place for social media people and graphic designers to showcase all of their work and give credit to themselves and other people that they work with. And so people can look at it, and it's just this whole portfolio of just everything that you do. But again, it's all about being consistent and being relevant as well, because over time, that's how you build a following. That's how people, that's how things get pushed more towards what you're doing because you're just being consistent. And it takes a lot, but if you just take it one day at a time and just look around for trends and figure out what kind of like your niche is, you're going to be fine.
And excuse me. And Neil, do you have any other advice for anybody out there who is watching or listening that might have an interest or a designer in joining us in the sports industry?
Fantastic question, Colton. And I think the biggest thing I would say to everybody is continue to, it's kind of a thing. It's basically saying be the same person you are at the top that you would be at the bottom. What I mean by that is you got to show everybody the same type of kindness and care, because when you do that, people will help you. I've been very fortunate that so many people have reached out and have helped me along my journey and really just wanting to, do what they can to help someone like me get through and we both know this, that the sports industry is grueling, it's brutal, it's cutthroat. I mean, look at ESPN cutting 500 plus people, it seems like a year, just because of cutting costs and things like that. And so the big thing for me is that you got to treat everybody with the same amount of respect, and not just like the people that hire you, but people you work alongside with, and even people who are behind the scenes. One thing that I love to do is whenever I've worked in some sort of a TV studio kind of thing, I always make sure when I first get there to introduce myself to everybody who's working on cameras and other things like that and kind of get to know them a little bit more personally, because I want them to feel like that we're all in this together. It's not just me sitting in front of a camera doing my spiel. It's everybody putting in that effort. And so for me, again, I think the biggest advice I tell people is just be yourself and be kind. Be kind because it will go such a long way, not just in the sports media industry, but in industries in general, because people will want to be around you more. People will want to work with you. People will go to great lengths to help you if you are a good person. And that's the way that I try to live my life. And that's the way that I think everybody should live their lives.
And finally, for you, Neil. Well, first off, where can people find the Devil State of Mind podcast? And what is your favorite memory as a whole being a part of the sports industry?
So my favorite memory, I think, without question, for when I look at my whole time in sports industry, is when I got the opportunity to broadcast. I got to do PA announcing for a couple of NHL preseason games when I was a little bit younger. They were kind of just like tryouts, really, because the Devils were looking for a PA announcer, and I was one of the finalists that got to do like one of the preseason games. I didn't end up winning, and even though I was disappointed, I was still happy that I got to do that, because it was like kind of one of those like feats that you could sit there and say, well, I did it. I got to that point. And is PA announcing my ultimate goal? No, but it's something that I also have really loved doing as well. So that stands out to me. And I think also being able to have the opportunity to meet people in this industry. I mean, I've been able to meet some of the best in the business. As I mentioned, Bruce Beck, Ian Eagle, Steve Gelbs with the New York Mets, Kevin Burkhardt went to the same college that I went to. Got a chance to work with him. Kenny Albert, I had a chance to meet and work with several times in my career. Just different guys like that. Having the opportunity to work with people that I grew up watching on TV, now getting to meet them in person and talk to them and have them compliment me and give me advice on what I need to do to get better is great. And so those are kind of like my big sports media memories up until this point. And then as far as the podcast, yeah, you can check it out wherever you listen to podcasts. So just search Devil State of Mind. Also, make sure to give us a sub on YouTube as we're approaching 200 subscribers. So if you haven't already, just search again Devil State of Mind. We're on social media at Facebook, Devil State of Mind Podcast, Twitter, Devil's State, just Devil State, and Instagram as well, Devil's State of Mind. And also you can follow the podcast through clips and different things on my personal TikTok account, Neil, Neil dot Villapiano, Villapiano. And also make sure to go check out all the stuff that goes on over on Pucks and Pitchforks, not just with my work, but with everybody over there that does a great job covering this New Jersey Devils team.
Neil, great stuff. Thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it, my friend.
Thank you so much for having me, Colton. I look forward to talking to you again real soon.